Who's doing the brainwashing?
Subversion.
A lot of it has been happening in academia since the 60s, so educators who were being encouraged and funded and supported by my boys from the Soviet Union at the time to demoralize the West. They encouraged a lot of these Marxists, and one of the things we haven't yet touched on is the ideology of wokeness is really a new form of Marxism. It's a kind of race Marxism.
Subversion.
I know this sounds like very abstract and crazy. I don't know, perhaps I can lay it out a little bit. So Marxism was an ideology created obviously by Karl Marx and Engels, who funded him and assisted him. And the idea was very simple. The idea was the way to understand human society is through the lens of oppression. There are some people who are the oppressors and some people who are oppressed. Who are the oppressors in Marx's original idea? The oppressors were the bourgeois, the capitalists, the people who owned what he called the means of production, the factories, the capital, the stock.
Subversion.
Like you are now a member of the bourgeoisie, a capitalist, you own a business. And what he said was that you are oppressing your producer and everyone who works for you because you take their labor and you profit from it without giving them back the right amount of value in exchange. And by the way, just like with a lot of these other ideas, it was true in the sense that Marxism really is a reaction to the rampant abuse that was caused by the Industrial Revolution, in which you had people sleeping in factories and chimney sweeps that were 12 years old, up chimneys, dying, all of that.
Subversion.
Right? So, as with all of these ideas, there is a kernel of truth. But what he said, and the people who really practice this idea the most were the Soviets and the Chinese communists, is, well, how do you solve this problem? Oh, very simple. You got to take from the oppressors and you got to give to the oppressed. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs. However, the problem is, it turns out that communism is effectively a great idea at the family level. Like, your family is a communist society, so is mine. I go out to work, I earn money, we spend it together on the needs of my wife, my children, blah, blah, blah.
Subversion.
That's communism, right? We share what one productive person produces. Other people do other jobs, they may not be paid as well, blah, blah, blah. The level of society doesn't really work because people are self-interested, and to make them not self-interested, to make them all give up everything for the needs of the state and of other people, you have to use a lot of force, which is why you have to kill 50 million people in Russia, 50 million people in China to even make it happen. Now, what happened was, when the Soviet Union was created, it was not designed to be a country-wide phenomenon.
Subversion.
The communists believed, and rightly by the way, that the only way communism would work is if you made everyone in the world communist. Because if you made everyone communist, then no one could look over the border and look at these evil capitalists having a great life. Everyone would be equally poor and then they'd be happy. That was the idea. So the idea of the Russian Revolution wasn't about making Russia communist. It was about making the world communist. It was the world revolution. That's why the symbolism of the Soviet Union, it never had anything to do with Russia or the Soviet Union on the flag. It had the globe and the hammer and sickle. The point was, this ideology was meant to spread to the entire world.
Subversion.
The problem was that when people saw what was actually happening in the Soviet Union, they really didn't want that. And most of all, people in Western societies, including the working class, who was supposed to be the oppressed and to overthrow their oppressive people, they didn't want that. They just wanted to have a nice life and to have a house and to blah, blah, blah. And so the Marxists in the West, they very quickly realized that this wasn't going to work. Western working class people were not going to overthrow the existing regime and have a Soviet-style revolution where they slaughter all the bourgeois and the capitalists. So they had to find a different way to approach it, which is why they invented this form of race Marxism. They said, no, you're not really oppressed because you're working class and you don't have capital. The reason you're oppressed is you're a man, you're gay, you're black, you're this, you're that. And that really landed. So what happened in the 60s is a lot of educators in academia started teaching these ideas to students. And then you have successive generations of people who are now essentially trained to think that our societies were bad. What they were was about oppression, racism, bigotry, imperialism, colonialism, slavery, etc., which all of these things have a kernel of truth, and that kernel of truth is used to tell gigantic lies.
Unlike a dictionary of English, Oxford Dictionary, subversion in Soviet terminology means always a destructive, aggressive activity aimed to destroy the country, nation, or geographical area of your enemy.
So there was a company in America called Tenant Media who were given $10 million in a very short period of time by Russia Today affiliated influencers and various nefarious actors from Russia, effectively to disseminate certain types of information through right-wing influencers in America. This has been happening for decades. There's a guy called Yuri Bezmenov. If you're not familiar with him, this guy's going to blow your mind. You should look him up. He was a Soviet defector in the 80s who came from the Soviet Union to India to Canada, ended up in America. He gave a series of lectures about what the Soviet intelligence services were actually focusing on. During the Cold War, you might not remember this, but people thought about Soviet spies as like stealing microfilms of American nuclear installations. And actually what he said was almost all of their resources were used on what he called demoralization.
Espionage as such occupies only 10 to 15% of money, time and manpower of the activity of K.G.B. The rest, 85%, is always subversion.
Demoralization is the process whereby you divide society and you activate nefarious forces within that society against the society. So you encourage forces that are destabilizing. This is one thing that people don't understand about Russian misinformation, disinformation, influence operations, etc. They're not designed to get a specific person elected. This is how British people and Americans think. They're like, well, I invest $10 million to get this outcome. It's not what they do. What they want is to create a cacophony of lies so that you don't know what to believe anymore. Is this true? Is that true? And so they are and were and have always been paying people in the West or using people in the West to sow discord, to divide people against each other.
The rest, 85%, is always subversion.